Eastern Siberia, winter of 1996. In that remote village where everyone knew what not to do, no one dared enter the forest after the first snowfall. It was an unspoken rule. When the wood creaks on its own and the sky darkens at 3 in the afternoon, you lock the door from the inside and pray that the generator will last the night. But Lucas, the newcomer, didn't follow rules he hadn't tested. That afternoon, with the sky darkening and the snow obscuring his tracks, he left the village on foot, carrying only a military knife, thin ropes, and his own stubbornness. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't ask for help. He didn't leave a note. "Idiot," muttered the grocery store owner, closing the windows. "Another one who's going to become a statue." In the forest, the cold wasn't the worst enemy. It was the silence. A silence that judged, that isolated, that wounded deeper than the ice. Lucas didn't know it, but what awaited him on the third night wasn't on the map, and it wasn't natural. The village of Cherny Les, in southern Siberia, had no more than 400 inhabitants. A gray dot on the map, forgotten among ancient pine trees and communist promises that never came to fruition. There, everyone knew each other, or at least pretended to. Faces were marked by the cold and the passage of time, gestures brief, greetings curt. That winter of 1996, the village survived as usual, chopping firewood, stockpiling salt, and waiting for the government trucks that occasionally came. And then Lucas arrived, tall, with a rigid posture, an urban accent, too discreet to be a tourist, too quiet to be welcome. They said he was an ex-soldier. Others swore he had fled the war in Chechnya. None of them were wrong. But what really bothered them was his gaze, the gaze of someone who observes more than participates. He rented a secluded cabin near the disused railway line. He never went to mass. He always bought the same things: matches, canned goods, cheap tobacco. He paid cash, never struck up a conversation. Sometimes he would spend hours looking at the sky, as if waiting for something to fall. The grocery store owner tried to strike up a conversation in the first month. Did he come seeking peace? "I came looking for silence," Lucas replied, without raising his eyes. The answer was sufficient. From that moment on, the village decided Lucas was not one of their own. At school, the children called him the Iceman. They said he didn't sleep, that he talked to trees, that he carried an invisible weapon. But Lucas didn't listen, or he listened and didn't react. He spent his days walking deep into the forest with a notebook and a pocket knife. He noted the rhythm of the winds, the direction of the footprints, the tree trunks that still breathed beneath the snow. He was preparing something. Winter came early that year. By mid-November, the nights were already below 10 degrees C. Old Vasily, from the weather station, warned, "Storm coming. 3 days of white hell." The village closed in, doors reinforced, stoves lit, families reunited. Then, at 3:47 p.m., Lucas was seen crossing the village's main trail, alone, heading towards the forest. No backpack, no flashlight, just a thick coat, a bundle of ropes, and an old pocket knife hanging from his chest. The blacksmith's daughter saw it and ran to tell. The blacksmith replied without taking his eyes off the axe, "Let them go. Everyone digs their own hole." Outside, the snowstorm was already beginning to whisper in the branches. Lucas disappeared among the tree trunks. No steps back, no cries for help. The forest swallowed him with the same coldness with which the village rejected him. But that night, in the darkness of his cabin, old Vasily made a curious note in his notebook. Pressure dropping. Strange signal. Someone went into the forest, without saying goodbye. The trail Lucas chose cut diagonally through the oldest forest in the region, a stretch where even the local hunters didn't dare venture. There the branches intertwined 5 or 6 meters high, forming a living dome. Snow barely penetrated, but the cold accumulated like a shadow. On the bank of an ancient frozen stream, he stopped before a tall, sturdy pine tree, old enough to withstand what he had in mind. No one there would ever think of building a shelter high up in a tree. It went against the logic of the cold, against what one learns in survival manuals. But Lucas wasn't looking for ordinary shelter. He was looking for time. Dry weather, away from damp ground, away from accumulated snow. Time to listen before anything approaches. He climbed up with his bare hands. Using ropes, he tied crossbars between 3 thick branches, forming a base suspended almost 3 meters high. He cut thick branches with his pocket knife and wove makeshift sides to support his body while he slept. He tied everything up silently, feeling the blood drain from his fingertips. The cold was taking its toll, but Lucas didn't stop. On top, he placed 3 layers: branches, waxed fabric, and dried moss. It wasn't protection. It was a truce, a human nest among the crows. By this time, the sky was already leaden gray. The first wave of the storm was approaching, fast and silent. Lucas climbed down one last time, gathered dry twigs from under hollow logs, climbed back up, and set up the base of the campfire on a stone slab, secured with ropes. Yes, he would make a fire at the top of the tree. He used bark shavings, scraps of fabric soaked in animal fat, and some dry straw kept in a canteen. The first spark was swallowed by the wind. The second one, also. On the third attempt, Lucas shielded the ember with his body bent over. He took a deep breath. He blew slowly. The flame was born weak, trembling as if doubting itself, but it stayed. At 6:02 p.m., Lucas was lying on a platform of branches, with a small fire beside him and the entire forest below him. Seen from a distance, it was just a motionless silhouette among the branches, as if the tree had adopted it. Below, the snow covered everything. The wolves wouldn't climb up. The cold would. He huddled together, drawing warmth into his coat. There were no more footsteps behind him. Everything now depended on him, the tree, and the fire. At 3 a.m., a stronger gust nearly brought the structure down. Lucas woke up with a dry crack and a strange feeling in his chest. He was no longer alone. Between the branches ahead, 2 eyes were watching him. The glance between the branches lasted less than 2 seconds, but it was enough. Lucas froze. Not because of the cold, but because of the instinct that had never left him. Those eyes were not wolf's eyes. They were too tall, too still. Humans, or almost. But when he turned on the flashlight strapped to his chest, it was already too late. The figure had vanished. No sound, no trace. Only branches swaying in the wind and the embers of the campfire struggling to stay alive. It was the first night, and the forest was already beginning to respond to his presence. Lucas composed himself. He stretched his body carefully, feeling his muscles tense. The temperature had plummeted to 17 degrees Celsius. With each breath, the steam formed thick clouds, and the hairs on his face froze in seconds. The bonfire began to die down. The firewood was damp inside, even with the makeshift insulation. Lucas had to go down carefully at 4 a.m. to retrieve more branches. Every movement calculated, every sound evaluated. The ice on the tree bark made cracking sounds that echoed like bones breaking. With a bundle of dry branches on his back, he climbed back into the shelter. He rekindled the fire with small pieces, short bursts of breath, and the last scraps of cloth soaked in fat. It took a while, but it worked. First victory. He settled on his side, his body curled up in a fetal position, breathing slowly to conserve energy. He slept in bursts, waking up with each crack. In the early morning, the cold changed color. The light didn't reach through, but the sky took on a light, leaden hue. Down below, the forest seemed petrified. No movement, no sound of birds. Lucas knew what that meant. Heavy snow ahead. The second challenge would be bigger, but first I needed food. He went down and searched around the shelter for footprints. He found shallow rabbit tracks, recent ones. He proceeded carefully, setting up a rudimentary trap with ropes and sticks stretched between low tree trunks. He returned to the shelter. He waited. 2 hours later, the trap had been triggered, but there was nothing inside. The noose was broken. The ropes had frozen and snapped on impact. First mistake. Lucas didn't despair. Retying the knots more firmly, he used the tip of his pocket knife to carve a lock from hardwood, protected with fabric to prevent it from freezing too quickly. Upon returning to the shelter, his fingers were bleeding. He warmed his hands near the fire and bit his lip to keep from screaming when his cracked skin regained its color. In the afternoon, the sky completely darkened. The snow came like a thick blanket, descending silently, covering everything with its weight and slowness. The flame of the bonfire began to fight against its own space. The blanket of branches was accumulating snow and threatening to collapse. Lucas crawled to the top of the shelter and carefully shook the structure, being careful not to loosen the ropes. The snow fell in sheets, revealing the gray sky for the last time before nightfall. When she went back to bed, something was different. The wind had stopped, and the silence was now absolute. In the village, this type of silence was called the breath of the forest. The elders said that was when she decided who could stay. Lucas didn't believe in those things, but that night, he didn't doubt them either. On the second night, the entire shelter seemed to breathe with him. The wood expanded and contracted in slow, cracking sounds. The bonfire crackled slowly, consuming the thin branches, as if it knew there would be no replenishment. Lucas kept his gaze fixed on nothingness. From up high, I could see the forest swallowed by the thick snow. No movement, no sound of life, until something happened. A sudden flash of light on the horizon, followed by a dry, muffled rumble but recognizable. Ice breaking. Lucas stood up suddenly. He looked down, and he saw, just a few meters from where he stood, the frozen stream was beginning to give way. The edges trembled and a dark crack slowly opened up in the center. Same direction as the rabbit trail, the same direction where, hours earlier, he had left a new trap set up with heavy branches. Something, or someone, was there. He climbed down from the tree as fast as his body would allow. His joints ached, his fingers already stiff. He walked with short steps, his weight evenly distributed, trying not to break the ice crust. As he approached, he saw. It was a dog, thin, dirty, his fur matted with snow, his front paw caught in a noose, his body trembling with pain and fear. But there was something more. The necklace, hanging around his neck, with a rusty little bell and a blue tag, symbol of the village. It was Professor Elena's dog. Lucas knelt down slowly. The animal growled softly. It was hungry, injured, and surrounded by an unseen danger. The already gnawed ice beneath them both. He took the pocket knife out of his pocket, placed it to the side, and held out his empty hand. The dog hesitated, but it didn't run away. It just trembled. Lucas cut the rope slowly, freeing the paw. The animal tried to run but slipped. Lucas held it tightly, pulling it up, feeling the surface creak beneath them. A mistake. Grave. The ice broke beneath our feet. Lucas sank up to his hips in icy water. The shock coursed through his entire body. The pain was immediate and paralyzing, but he was holding the dog in his arms. With one thrust, he threw the animal out of the hole and with his other arm, sought support on the nearest root. He climbed through clenched teeth, blood pounding in his ears, his chest constricted by the water. Every second there could be the last. When he came out, he was in thermal shock. The soaked clothes froze against the skin. The fingers could no longer close. The dog watched him standing still. Lucas fell to his knees. He took off his wet coat, leaving only his thermal sweatshirt on. She threw the cloth over the dog. He was trembling, but he stayed. At that moment, Lucas made a choice. Going back to the shelter was impossible in that state, but abandoning the dog is also an option. He tied the animal to his waist with its own rope, wrapped them both in a waxed plastic bag he carried on his belt, and began to walk back slowly, one step at a time, against the snow that weighed like cement. It took almost an hour to reach the tree. He almost fell twice. The skin on their arms was raw and bleeding. The blood was flowing slower. The fire was already extinguished. But he arrived. With his last few seconds of strength, he lifted the dog in his arms, climbed on his knees to the shelter, and lay down beside him, embracing him. The bonfire did not return that night, but neither of them slept alone. High above, among the trees, the forest watched, silently. The third day began without light. The blizzard covered everything with a thick, opaque layer. From the top of the tree, Lucas saw only white. White everywhere. White in his eyes. White in his lungs. Breathing hurt. His body was in shock. His muscles were locked up. His left shoulder burned. The fall on the ice had left invisible marks. Beside them, the dog slept, curled up, still alive. Lucas reached out his hand. The touch of the fur was the only warmth he could still feel. He tried to get up. He fell. He tried again. It fell. On the third attempt, he just sat there panting. The cold was winning, and he knew it. The fire had died down. No heat, no food, no fuel, and now no time. He would need to go down and make a fire on the ground. It was risky, but staying on top was a life sentence. With stiff movements, Lucas tied the dog to his own body, wrapped in scraps of waxed fabric. He lowered himself, bracing his weight on his elbows, knees, and the ropes that no longer trusted him. On the ground, the forest seemed hostile, but different, too quiet. It was no longer the silence of the cold. It was the silence of something absent. No howling, no birds, no snapping of branches. Only the sound of their own footsteps and the wind rustling through the trees. He gathered dry branches, remnants of roots, frozen leaves, anything that could burn, even for a few seconds. He built the structure in a hole between two rocks. He used his body as a shield against the wind. He tried to light it. Nothing. The flint was wet. The spark was weak. He tried again, and again. With a trembling hand, he pulled out his spare lighter, hidden in a metal capsule attached to the waistband of his pants, protected from the ice. He used the last scrap of soaked fabric. The fire started. Weak, but alive. Lucas sat down before the flame, hugging the dog to his chest. There the two breathed as one. The wood was cracking. The smoke rose, straight up. It was at that moment that he heard steps, irregular rhythm, heavy, coming from the south. Lucas picked up the pocket knife. He remained silent. The dog growled softly. Among the snow-covered branches, a silhouette emerged, thin, face hidden by a scarf, bare hands, trembling. It was Sergei, the blacksmith's grandson, 17 years old. He had been missing for 3 days. The whole village thought he had run away to the city. He fell to his knees. "Help," she murmured, her lips turning purple. Lucas didn't speak. He simply pulled him closer to the fire, took off his own sweatshirt, and wrapped it around the boy. He tore pieces of cloth to protect his hands. He gave him the only protein bar that remained in the inside pocket. No questions asked, no demands, no pride. Sergei just stared, and he understood. There, in that makeshift shelter, were a rejected ex-military man, a village dog, and a boy that everyone had forgotten. The fire was now 3 in number. During the night, the storm subsided. The sky cleared for the first time in 3 days. The trees creaked again. The birds started singing again. And at dawn, the snow trail revealed 3 sets of footprints, heading back to the village. The village of Cherny Les was not used to being surprised. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind finally died down. The blizzard had dissolved into a static, dry cold. Inside the houses, the doors began to open cautiously, and it was there at 7:42 in the morning that 3 figures emerged from the forest. Lucas, covered in snow and frozen mud, Sergei, leaning on his shoulder, and Professor Elena's dog with its tail down, but walking on its own. They crossed the main trail in silence. The blacksmith dropped the axe on the ground. The grocery store owner covered her mouth with her hand. The teacher left the house barefoot, knelt down, and hugged the dog tightly. Nobody applauded. Nobody screamed. But the silence was different now. That same afternoon, Sergei's grandmother knocked on the door of Lucas's cabin. I said nothing. She simply left a bowl of soup on the doorstep, covered with an embroidered cloth. He left without looking back. The next day, a pile of firewood appeared stacked next to his house. Then a pair of new gloves, handmade, were carefully left on the windowsill. No one apologized. Nobody needed it. The village spoke with gestures. And now, Lucas did too. The following Friday, Professor Elena stopped next to him at the grocery store. "He sleeps with me now. The dog. Since that day, he hasn't left my side. Break. Thanks." Lucas simply nodded. He picked up the matches. He paid. It went out. The following week, something changed. A group of young people from the village, led by Sergei, began to erect a watchtower near the entrance to the forest. Inspired by the structure Lucas had made in the tree, which was now known to everyone, described in detail by Sergei, they began to build something similar, not out of vanity, but as proof that the forest could also be respected. Lucas passed by there once carrying a bundle of firewood. Sergei saw him and went down. "We are using the knot technique that you demonstrated." Lucas watched. He touched one of the strings. He squeezed. He nodded, and he continued on his way. Sergei smiled. It was enough. The village never said it explicitly, but everyone knew. He was one of their own now. Weeks passed. Winter offered no respite, but the village changed. Not in speeches, but in small habits. Now, when someone was chopping wood near the forest, they would look up. Some began using double ropes to secure their provisions. Others learned to read the wind as Lucas did, feeling in their cheeks what was previously invisible. The treehouse shelter became a story told around the stove. Some said it was the work of a madman. Others said it was pure genius. But they all ended up saying the same thing. If it weren't for that, Sergei wouldn't have come back. The boy changed too. Quieter, more attentive. He began walking with a notebook, copying the drawings of knots and structures he remembered. Sometimes he observed Lucas from afar, as if waiting for permission to learn more. One day he approached. "I want to know how you managed not to scream when you fell on the ice." Lucas looked. He thought for a moment. Then he replied curtly, "Shouting doesn't help you climb." And that was all. But for Sergei, it was like a map. In the following months, he began helping his grandfather at the blacksmith shop. He learned to sharpen tools, build safe traps, and, quietly, began to prepare his own structure, smaller, lower, but inspired by the shelter of the tree. Lucas watched, but he never interfered. At the beginning of spring, when the snow began to melt, Professor Elena did something unexpected. He left an envelope on the doorstep of Lucas's cabin. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper. "If you want to teach, the school has an empty shed. It could be on Wednesdays. Only for those who want to learn." No signature, just a small blue bell drawn in the lower corner. Lucas stood there for minutes, motionless. He folded the paper carefully. He put it in his pocket. And that night, for the first time, he lit a fire outside the shelter. Weeks passed. Winter offered no respite, but the village changed. Not in speeches, but in small habits. Now, when someone was chopping wood near the forest, they would look up. Some began using double ropes to secure their provisions. Others learned to read the wind as Lucas did, feeling in their cheeks what was previously invisible. The treehouse shelter became a story told around the stove. Some said it was the work of a madman. Others said it was pure genius. But they all ended up saying the same thing. If it weren't for that, Sergei wouldn't have come back. The boy changed too. Quieter, more attentive. He began walking with a notebook, copying the drawings of knots and structures he remembered. Sometimes he observed Lucas from afar, as if waiting for permission to learn more. One day he approached. "I want to know how you managed not to scream when you fell on the ice." Lucas looked. He thought for a moment. Then he replied curtly, "Shouting doesn't help you climb." And that was all. But for Sergei, it was like a map. In the following months, he began helping his grandfather at the blacksmith shop. He learned to sharpen tools, build safe traps, and, quietly, began to prepare his own structure. Smaller, lower, but inspired by the shelter of the tree. Lucas watched, but he never interfered. At the beginning of spring, when the snow began to melt, Professor Elena did something unexpected. He left an envelope on the doorstep of Lucas's cabin. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper. "If you want to teach, the school has an empty shed. It could be on Wednesdays. Only for those who want to learn." No signature, just a small blue bell drawn in the lower corner. Lucas stood there for minutes, motionless. He folded the paper carefully. He put it in his pocket. And that night, for the first time, he lit a fire outside the shelter.